And in this video, we're going to take a detailed look at the final campaign of the Revolutionary War, and that is the surrender of a British army at Yorktown, Virginia. Frankly, it's a fairly complicated campaign, and the Navy plays at least as important a role in the final success of a joint French-American army in forcing the surrender of the British army at Yorktown, Virginia. So, let's get into it. You may recall that the British Army, commanded by General Cornwallis, had burned their wagon train and all their supplies in North Carolina in order to move faster. And that then required that they also move to the coast and meet the Royal Navy, who were able to then resupply and provide some replacements for his army. At that point, General Cornwallis also decided that his best bet for controlling the southern colonies was to control Virginia. And so he moved his army into Virginia and coincidentally received instructions from his commander in New York to establish a deep water port on Chesapeake Bay. And that's when General Cornwallis moved his army to Yorktown, Virginia, and began to fortify that port city. When he moved into Virginia, he also took command of all the British troops that were in that region. These were troops commanded by the American trader Benedict Arnold, now a brigadier general in the British Army. With Arnold's troops, his overall strength was 9,300 soldiers. At that point, he was also being shadowed by American troops, commanded by General Lafayette, the French officer who had joined the Continental Army earlier. The previous year, a French expeditionary force of 5,500 soldiers had landed and taken possession of Newport, Rhode Island. At this point, they began to march as well to join General Washington when he learned that the French West Indies fleet would provide naval support for his army. However, not in New York, which was General Washington's choice, but rather in the Chesapeake Bay. The French fleet would only be available until mid-October, which was the end of the hurricane season in the Caribbean. And then they would be required to sail back to the Indies to protect their colonies there from the British. General Washington misled the British in New York City. And with the French troops from Newport, he moved south to join General Lafayette in Virginia with the intentions of trapping General Cornwallis and his army at Yorktown. But this was a tenuous time for General Washington because the Continental Congress was broke. The various colonies had refused to pay taxes, and the Congress was unable to provide money to support General Washington and the army, and therefore the French stepped up and began to pay the majority of expenses for both the Continental Army and the French Expeditionary Force. Now, the key to success insofar as capturing General Cornwallis and his army actually lay at sea, where French and British fleets contested control of the Chesapeake Bay. If the British were able to persevere, they of course could either resupply General Cornwallis or take his army aboard. In mid-August, 14 British ships of the line arrived to support General Cornwallis. As there was no French naval presence at that point, they then sailed back to New York. At the end of August, the French fleet arrived from the West Indies with 28 ships of the line, plus troop transports, and immediately put 3,000 French soldiers ashore to join General Lafayette. Coincidentally, the British offshore squadron joined the British ships in New York, and learning that the French had arrived, they sailed for Chesapeake Bay with a combined fleet of 19 British ships. On 5 September, the Royal Navy met the stronger French fleet at sea, and after exchanging broadsides and maneuvering for almost 4 days, the British broke off the action and returned to New York. Their departure left the French in control of Chesapeake Bay and, in fact, sealed the fate of General Cornwallis, who had his British and German troops backed up against the York River at Yorktown. Meanwhile, a second French fleet had arrived from Newport, Rhode Island, with the heavy artillery that General Washington required to initiate a full-scale siege of Yorktown. While the French fleet controlled the waters off the Virginia Capes, the combined American and French ground forces, totaling 17,800 men, began work to seal off the Yorktown Peninsula. During early September, the troops commenced operations digging parallels, dragging cannon into place, and overrunning British outposts. A total of 100 siege guns then began to bombard Yorktown's defenses on 9 October, and they were soon hammering the British nonstop. During the attack, some Americans could not suppress their high spirits, as Captain James Duncan recorded in his diary. A militiaman possessed of more bravery than prudence stood on the parapet and dodged cannonballs while shaking his fist at the British. He had escaped longer than could have been expected, and brandishing his fists at every ball that was fired till, unfortunately, one came and smashed him and put an end to his capers. On 17 October 1781, General Cornwallis finally was forced to ask for terms, and 2 days later, after repeated trips between the lines by appointed representatives and much discussion and much debate, the Articles of Surrender were finalized. An American surgeon named James Thatcher wrote about his experience during the siege. In addition to events that required his professional expertise, as when he amputated the legs of a man who had been hit by a cannonball, he was also present at the British surrender. And he wrote, "It was about 2 o'clock when the captive army advanced through the line formed for their reception. Some of the British officers appeared to be exceedingly chagrined when given the word ground arms. And I am a witness that they performed this duty in a very unofficer-like manner, and that many of the soldiers manifested a sullen and stubborn temper, throwing their arms on the pile with violence as if determined to break them and render them useless." General Washington insisted that the Articles of Surrender for the British Army at Yorktown be the very same as those previously imposed on General Lincoln when he was forced to surrender an American army at Charleston in 1780. General Cornwallis declared that he was indisposed and too ill to attend the surrender ceremony when his British and German soldiers marched out to surrender their weapons. His second in command, General O'Hara, attempted to hand General Cornwallis's ceremonial sword to the French commander, who responded, "We are subordinate to the Americans. General Washington will give you your orders." General Washington declined to take the sword from General Cornwallis's subordinate, General O'Hara, and gave the honor to his second in command, General Lincoln. Legend has it that one stipulation of the surrender agreement was that the British must play their own tune when they surrendered, and not a mocking version of Yankee Doodle. which had been their first choice. So the British chose to play a popular ballad of the time called "The World Turned Upside Down," which seemed to be particularly apropos for the British circumstance. The 9,000 British and German troops surrendered at Yorktown took place exactly 4 years to the day after the British surrender at Saratoga, and large-scale military operations in North America came to an end. In April 1782, negotiations began in Paris to end the war. A bilateral peace treaty was finally signed the following January, bilateral between the British and the Americans. On 19 April 1783, the news was announced to the Continental Army. Again, exactly 8 years to the day after the war started on the Lexington Green. The British troops in New York City finally sailed on 25 November, while other British garrisons lingered. The British troops stationed in Niagara and Detroit, as an example, did not leave for 3 more years. When General Washington prepared to resign his commission, he met with about 40 officers who had agreed to join him for an emotional farewell. Other officers refused to attend. They were angry that neither their back pay nor any form of retirement was being paid by the Continental Congress. After pouring a glass of wine, General Washington turned to the attendees and said, "With a heart full of love and gratitude, I now take my leave of you. I most devoutly wish that your latter days may be as prosperous and as happy as your former ones have been glorious and honorable." Much later, Colonel Benjamin Talmadge recalled, quote, "Such a scene of sorrow and weeping I had never before witnessed. The simple thought that we were then about to part from the man who had conducted us through a long and bloody war, and under whose conduct the glory and independence of our country had been achieved, and that we should see his face no more in this world, seemed to me utterly unsupportable," unquote. Dealing with citizens who had sided with the British was a serious problem, and conflict among Americans was far from over. Recognizing the problem, General Washington had recommended as early as April 1782 that the Continental Congress pardon the 75 regiments of American loyalists who were in British service. His advice, of course, was ignored. Patrick Henry wrote, quote, "Loyalists have, to be sure, mistaken their own interests most woefully, and most woefully have they suffered the punishments due to their offense. But the relations which we bear to them now are changed. The quarrel is over. Peace has returned and found us a free people," end quote. But anger ran deep, and some 200,000 American loyalists went into forced or voluntary exile when the British departed the newly sovereign United States. The British ruling class at the time, symbolized by the officers who were serving in the Royal Navy and the British Army, demonstrated a sense of superiority and arrogance that was matched by the fact that they were poor losers when it came to allowing the colonies their independence. In addition to holding a number of garrisons south of the Great Lakes on land that was ceded to the United States by the Treaty of Paris, the British also stayed in several northern seaports long beyond the time when they were required to depart. In addition, the British Navy got in the habit of stopping American ships at sea and having British officers go aboard, interview the crews and decide if some crew members should in fact be removed from the American ship and forced to join the British crew. The result, of course, that relations between the United States and Great Britain were not smooth, and there was a consistent, ongoing tension, particularly on the part of the United States. American leaders felt that they had been pushed into a position where they were required to reconfirm American sovereignty. The War of 1812, oftentimes referred to as the Second War of Independence, will be the next American Army campaigns that we look at. And until then, God bless America.